Good morning, and a very, very warm welcome to this lovely lakeside lecture theatre. It's a real pleasure to see you all, and I'm here on behalf of the Sheldon Memorial Trust, which was founded shortly after the war by Oliver Sheldon. He never lived to see the university actually built, but he was one of the moving spirits behind York getting a university. And we're privileged to have with us Peter Addyman, who I think must be the longest serving still member of the Sheldon Trust. I think I'm right in that, Peter, aren't I? Anyway, Peter is going to speak to us today about York's monument men and women. It's a very interesting and a very topical subject, actually. At this time, while plans for York and what's happening with building and so on in the city is an ongoing and sometimes controversial topic. He's going to talk about the Royal Commission of Historic Monuments, who were actually set up just after World War II in 1946 by King George VI. And their remit was to look at towns and cities and places across England and Wales to make a record of all the archaeological and other remains from Roman times up to, well, they had a cut-off date of 1714, but I think it's been extended a bit since then. Anyway, Peter's going to tell us about the work that was done by these people, which in fact led into his own work. As some of you may know, Peter arrived here in York in the early 70s at a time when it was planned to put a ring road, an inner ring road through York, and to destroy all of Gillygate and many historic buildings. And anyway, Peter's arrival led to all sorts of things, as we know, including his later becoming the founding father, really, behind the York Archaeological Trust and the Jorvik. Anyway, without any more ado, I'm delighted to welcome Peter, and also to say that actually in the audience today we do have Mrs. Black, who is one of the original York Monument women. So it's a privilege to have you here as well. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for giving me the honour of giving a Sheldon Memorial Lecture. I remember that institution being set up soon after Oliver Sheldon died. He was a member of the staff of Rowntree's, but he devoted much of his spare energies to cultural matters in York, leading to the setting up of the Civic Trust and goodness knows what else. So it's wonderful that we memorialise him every year, and I'm particularly glad to be giving a Sheldon lecture, because I think I'm probably pretty well the only person in the room, I may be wrong on this, you can tell me, who attended the first of these lectures, and that was way back in 1951. Anybody else there? No. The lecturer there was this splendid man, whom I came to know very well later on, Ian Richmond. Ian wasn't a sir in those days, and I was at that time a Harrogate schoolboy. I was already interested in archaeology, and my father took me to York Racecourse, where this distinguished professor of Roman archaeology was setting out all that was then known about the story of Roman York. And he was doing that, of course, because at that particular moment, the Royal Commission on Historical Monuments was turning its attention to the problems of recording the historic monuments of York. The commission, I think, was set up in the Royal Commission in its later form was set up in 1946, and its work in York only culminated many years later after its start in 1962, was it? 1952. Richmond was chairman of this Commission's supervising subcommittee for York, and that committee over the next several decades carried out research that would identify York's amazing collection of historic buildings and archaeological sites, that would investigate and record many of them, and that would publish a summary of the results in a series of magnificent scholarly volumes, and then archive each and every record and every record card, every drawing, every photograph, and every account of such buildings in the Royal Commission's central offices, which is now these days in Swindon. And you can see there on the table the outcome of their work in a series of magnificent publications. So that's really the subject of this morning's lecture. And some of it is his happy memories of what was then a schoolboy, and has subsequently been involved in most aspects of York's history and archaeology ever since. So the one thing about me is that I've met most of these people, which is always a happy memory. Sir Ian Richmond's advice was to concentrate first on an inventory of Roman remains. I suppose that was why he was leading that particular lecture that I went to, that Sheldon Memorial Lecture number 1. The Roman remains largely constituted archaeological remains. He thought that might be a quick win for the Royal Commission, because it was well known that once they started on a town, they went on forever, and they were always being criticised for never producing anything. He thought this would be a quick first book, quick in a relative sense. And so they all started their work on oops, I haven't done it. What am I doing? There we are. Their work on York. The initial thing was to find somewhere to work, and they took over this lovely white building in Bootham, the White House in Bootham. And that was where I turned up one day, having been sent over by the nice lady in the Harrogate Museum to see Mr. Ram, and Mr. Ram had an office in there. It was, as I seem to remember, a hive of activity. There were scholars parked in each of the offices, each of the rooms, all beavering away on research, and there were technical staff doing fascinating technical things, photography and drawing and all that kind of stuff, and all sorts of secretarial people following up on turning it into words and so forth. Herman was very sympathetic. He was a Romanist, and he knew my advisor in York, in Harrogate, very well, and she'd sort of said, look after him. So he did, and he took me round and quietly introduced me to his colleagues, who didn't really want to know particularly, and whispered comments about them. So I got these insights into these wonderful people, these monuments, men and women. Some were quite sympathetic and kindly, and helped me to see what they were doing. But Herman warned me that some wouldn't be quite so sympathetic, because they didn't think there should be a schoolboy around in their office. A naive youngster, what was he doing there? And so he advised caution in getting to know some of them. Now, one of them was Tom French. Tom French was an expert on churches and stained glass, and we'll see in a few minutes. Am I due for a next slide? I think I probably am. Sorry, what am I doing? The wrong ones. He was an expert on stained glass. And of course, for stained glass, constantly recording photographically. He was also an expert photographer. So when I asked Herman, what sort of a camera should I have for an archaeologist? He said, talk to Tom French. Well, Tom French was less than friendly. And Herman said, be careful when you talk to him. He doesn't think you should be here. And he didn't really. But in the event, I did get recommended a camera, and I came to respect Tom French as the author of the Commission's work on the majority of York's many churches, and particularly on his recording and analysis of York's incomparable collection of ancient stained glass. Well, other scholars in the Royal Commission were studying aspects of York's building appropriate to their own speciality, and Herman was already the most active archaeologist in and around York, and he was engaged with his colleagues on the production of the book that you see on the screen at the moment, Iberarchum Roman York. So the first years of their positive activity, some of them in parallel working on later volumes, but was push out Iberarchum Roman York as Ian Richmond has suggested. No, I'm getting this wrong. There we go. That was the cover of it, and there are two versions. I don't know why one is grey and one is pink. They're exactly the same inside, that appeared as the first result of this work in 1962. Well, I was there in early 1950s, so 1962 is about 10 years' work, and it's, of course, a statement of all that was then knowable and recordable about Roman York. It's unusual for a Royal Commission volume, because there ain't an awful lot of Roman York above ground, and there's a monument, of course, the walls are there and so on. But the Commission in this case said that it needed to define the city and its origins, and engage their investigators on a search of all the records. And there are huge numbers of records of Roman finds in York going back into the 16th century, actually, some of the earliest, but certainly in the 18th century, and increasingly in the 19th century, when excavations for the station and goodness knows what were taking place. So Herman Ram, with one or two of his helpers, the Romanist and the archaeologists, got this volume together in that time. They were listing things like the monuments you all know. Here's the Maltangular Tower, of course. Bottom half is Roman. Roman wall on the right, pretty well all Roman. And in addition to that, it's possible to make imaginative reconstructions of what it originally could have been like. We're a bit down to the right now, looking at King's Square, and down to the other Maltangular Tower at the very far end, which is just off Market Street, under one of those shops. And that was quite an informative experience for me, because working in York, I went with Herman sometimes to look at places where some of this was actually being uncovered in modern development. They were there, the Commission staff was then able to record them and add it to their record. In addition to the great fortress, which you see there between the two rivers, is for Roman York, of course, not quite equally large, but it's a substantial civil town. And around the civil town are cemeteries. So the work that team was doing, and all the several hundred years of records of things that have been found in the past, led them to create this kind of distribution map and to warn the city for all time and future where new development would have an impact. Similarly, in more detail, in the area of the older fortress, where the various defences might be, overlaid with the modern streets, and with the cemeteries also marked on it. Well, that's the area involved, and you can see the problem. Archaeology in York is impeded by a modern city, and it's a modern city that is impeded in its development by a vast number of surviving historical buildings. So the work that we're discussing this morning has been absolutely fundamental over the last few years, in moderating the rate of destruction of the heritage in York and enabling suitable work to be done when threats can't be avoided, such as this. It's the ring road. It wasn't ever built, but it was in the 1970s, a proposal, early 1970s, a proposal. By that time, I'd become an archaeologist of some experience anyway, and I was persuaded to come to York, give up my very nice job down in the south of England, and the first thing that I was faced with was the ring road, going round quite a lot of Herman Ram's and his colleagues' cemeteries. You see, it cuts through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cemeteries. And so in 1972, a number of excavations were started there on the basis of that work, preserved for posterity in those volumes of the Royal Commission. Actually, within 18 months, the minister had abandoned the idea of a ring road round York, thank heavens. It was an awful one round Canterbury in Kent. It was a disaster. And I think the lesson was learned that ring roads around city walls, not a good idea. And so most of the excavations I did then were not particularly at that time, as it turned out, necessary. Well, this work that the Royal Commission Roman team was doing formed a stimulus to archaeology in York, but particularly in Yorkshire in general. Herman and some of his friends became council members of the Yorkshire Archaeological Society, and their input there was, in their various periods of expertise, very great. Eric G., one of their foremost medievalists, I think he became president of the Yorkshire Archaeological Society. I think Herman Ram himself also at one day did. But in addition to that, as this was a sort of repository of expertise in archaeology in an otherwise desert of archaeology in Yorkshire, they often got called out to other sites. And since I was out there helping, I was often taken on bumpy rides across remote fields to look at ancient monuments that were threatened with this or that amount of destruction. And I remember spending a summer with Herman Ram excavating Newton Kime, the Roman fort that at that time was threatened with the road. Anyhow, let's move on. The Royal Commission's team involved not only specialists in Roman archaeology, but in every other period up to the present. And the next, having produced that first volume relatively quickly, in 1962, well, relatively quickly, nearly 10 years, 62, out came the defences in 1972. My gosh, think of that long period from the time that I first met them in 1952. Anyhow, here's a copy, and that's also on the table. And the defences, of course, involve a huge number of sites, including some of the major monuments, York Castle with their tremendous analysis of that, which again it was a standard for its time, and for the area where there are no medieval features surviving, but plenty of historic buildings, the courtyard that would have been behind it in the Middle Ages, and the York Castle report. Also, they were looking at the gates and the defences. Here we are, just on the northern side of York, looking at the city walls with the wall on the top, the ditch outside, and a little view of one of the gateways in the background. And there, of course, they were dealing not just with the Roman origins, but with a long story of development. The Towers and Walls, therefore, was a volume that followed. Let me have this pause for a moment. Yep. Just reminding you of what that volume comprises. But it also comprises archaeological work. And you see here a wonderful cross-section of not just the, well, it is the city wall, but it's the wall between the city and the abbey in the area behind King's Manor. And it's a cross-section drawing that was done partially, initially, by Geoffrey Radley, a person who joined the Royal Commission team a little bit later, but who was an expert on things medieval and particularly on the defences. He was instrumental in much of the recording of that great volume on the defences, and when I knew him, he was also involved in quite a lot of archaeology in York that was not necessarily the Royal Commission's job, but which was absolutely vital in recording evidence. For example, he was always jumping into people's cellars to record Viking levels of stuff as they deepened the cellars. And his evidence was what I used in deciding that the area around Coppergate was a very good idea many years later on for a massive excavation to show what Viking York might have been like. So good old Geoffrey did a hell of a good job recording stuff just outside his normal remit. But he also started archaeological investigations to back up the Royal Commission's descriptions of the superficial remains of the defences. And this cross-section ultimately produced is the sort of thing that was involved. You see on the left, right down at the very bottom, the Roman fortress wall. And then you see the massive series of earthworks that grew up above it in the post-Roman period. And then you see towards the top, when it had reached this in massive height, the medieval wall that goes up in the 14th century. And then you see to the right of that the detritus of the subsequent centuries, and right on the end, the modern fill back up against a 19th century wall. This is all behind the city library. Well, Geoffrey began those excavations and obviously had this sort of thing in mind. That is how they ended up with the Roman wall left, the Roman wall in the foreground, the medieval wall on top of what had formerly been the mound on the left, and its backing wall on the right. This is all behind the library. And there we are, you can see those various periods set out. This is the sort of thing that Geoffrey had in mind when he was doing that wonderful cross-section. He took the cross-section across the abbey wall and down this now beautiful bit of greensward outside. And there was a very deep trench there which showed the flow of the layers and the old ground surface beneath them, giving the full story on the other side of the defences. One day, when he was recording the cross-section there, which he did when the workmen were off to lunch and it wasn't full of busy activity, the whole thing collapsed on him and killed him. So here we have a memorial of a lovely man. This plaque is erected to the memory of Geoffrey Radley, who carried out the excavations of the tower and was tragically killed in a subsequent accident at the site on the 22nd of July, 1970. I'm not quite sure I can read that. 2, is it? Yes. Well, he was a great guy, and I liked him very much. In addition to that, the city had, of course, to deal with the central areas of York, where most of the historic buildings were, and where a very large number of structures had to be recorded. And some of the subsequent volumes, volume three there over on the table are the result of that work. Volume 3, southwest of the Ouse, with, again, a whole range of aspects to them. Here is the view down the side of Bale Hill Terrace, looking towards Bale Hill, reminding you that this area too had its defences and its area behind the defences, all of which were studied and lovingly recorded. When they set out, historic buildings were limited to those that were built before 1714. And not many of those are built before 1714 on the south bank of the River Ouse, but eventually the remit was extended to, I think it was, somebody will remind me, was it 1858? Well, a lot of them actually do become involved. But nevertheless, suffice it to say that there are very large numbers of historic buildings in the area within the walls south of the Ouse, and some of them are fairly obvious. Here we are looking down Micklegate with this gorgeous range of 18th century buildings, every one of which was, well, no, not every one of which, most of which were lovingly inspected by one or other members of this great team of specialists. When I say not everyone, because the Royal Commission staff did not have a right of entry anywhere. At that time, anyway, certainly, I don't know whether they do now, but they did not have a right of entry anywhere. So it was a matter of persuading owners to allow these nosy parkers into the building to look at all their beams and cellars. And I mean, would you let unknown people into your house? A lot of people said, no, I don't, sorry, no. Sorry, sir, no. You go back in a fortnight's time, had you been able to? No, I don't want it. So they never got into some buildings, but they got into most of them, and they made the records, which, as I say, are preserved for posterity down in Swindon on these record cards. They took photographs because they had a professional photographer, and they then listed and made a inventory of every building and all the details of it, the doorways, the railway, the railings, and so on and so forth. And that work southwest of the Ouse was eventually completed with the help of a whole number of wonderful people in the Royal Commission on Historical Monuments. I think particularly of David Black, who did work, I think, Valerie, quite a lot in that area. Did a substantial amount of work. Mrs. Black is here today. And I think I ought to mention that the only person here today who was on that team that published volume on Roman York was Mrs. Black. And I think we should give her as the sole survivor of that fantastic team a bit of a clap for what they did. Valerie will have vivid memories of all that went on then, and she certainly, as an editorial assistant at that time, called V.E. Whitfield, I think, in those days, but she eventually married the historic buildings investigator, David Black. She'll remember. Anyhow, here we are still in volume 3, where David did much of his work. And there are all sorts, of course, of aspects there. A lot of the work is studying the timber framings and the timber detailings. And here we are looking at Jacob's Well, which is on the street just off Micklegate, at the top of the hill there. And it's a remarkably preserved porch. And, of course, inside, if you can, it is, I think, semi-publicly available. You can see inside that it has been restored, probably as a result of the analyses done by these specialists to be something like its medieval form. But of course the buildings included, but when the remit went on forward to much later buildings, and here you see some that were included. On the left, I think the old station just about made it. The one on the right, the new station headquarters, 1902, or thereabouts, not included. But a fantastic volume, volume 3, and a tribute to those scholars. Within it are a number of churches. Each of the area volumes have, of course, wonderful sections on York's 20 medieval and other churches. And here we are in one from that Micklegate volume. This is Holy Trinity Micklegate up on the top of the hill. And its churchyard is full of recordable monuments. And, of course, so is its interior, like the Church of All Saints North Street, also in that volume, with this is one of York's prized surviving medieval churches, of course, with its architectural features, its wonderful angel roof, angels up here, see them, there they are in rows, with its windows and its stained glass. And this reminds me to show the detailing that had to be recorded, and to remind you that for this work, this commission had on its staff some brilliant photographers and brilliant draftsmen too, who could turn out an accurate record of things as magnificent as this. It also had, as I think I've mentioned already, specialists on different aspects of the past. And I think here of Tom French, a poor chap who was warned off. I was warned off when I first went there as being not really sympathetic to children. He was responsible for inventorying most of the incomparable amount of stained glass, not the minster, but of the stained glass of the churches, the parish churches of York. And we've made here a montage of 4 items for you in the Church of All Saint North Street. The top right is rather nice. It shows his vision of a medieval town, which is what this is all about. And so it's a contemporary picture of a medieval town. Could be York, I don't know. We've seen the bridge across the River Ouse in a previous slide, and there's a picture of a bridge with a fish jumping out of the river, bless them. The guys top left are military folk, one asleep, various elements of dress and so on. Fascinating record of contemporary life. And bottom left are individuals. When I was preparing this, somebody said, yes, it reminds me of the, what was it? The Royal Commission, that's right, saying, oh my gosh, not about us. Anyhow, there they are in All Saints North Street. And this is only one of a huge number of these fantastic compendia of stained glass that the Commission produced. In addition to that, of course, churches have fittings of one sort and architectural features. And those of you who know the volumes well, and I'm sure some of you do, will know just how accurate and how many of these things have been lovingly recorded in words and in pictures and in interpretations in the great volumes. So that was a short dissertation on the fantastic Volume 3 and a tribute to the people who were active in making that. So here we move on to the northeast, the central area, and of course it contains an extraordinary wealth of structures. Sorry, am I wrong on this? Yep, that's right. Things like the St Mary's Abbey, of course. Things like the Yorkshire Museum eventually became within the remit. Things like the King's Manor, all buildings outside the city walls. And here we're looking at the walls and towers and bars, again, another of their great volumes, looking down past what they call the hamlet of St Mary's these days, down Marygate, and looking out into the suburbs for the coverage of the areas outside the walls. The remit has to include now all these 18th century buildings and this great series in Bootham, which is now largely Bootham School. But the central area, sorry, I seem to have jumped one there. The central area is volume 5. And volume 5, when did that come out? Volume 5. Volume 3 came out in 73. Volume 5 came out in 81. You're quite right. It's up there, is it? Well. Hey, who's giving this lecture anyway? No, here's the wonderful cover of that volume with its view across the square and up Stonegate towards the Minster. A view giving you the complexity of what had to be included in that volume. Not, of course, the castle, we've dealt with that. Not the Minster, because they never really dealt with that, but most of the rest of the things you see on that slide were the subject of this incredible challenge of evaluating York's historic buildings. A lovely, good view in the foreground of something that's now become the cherished headquarters of the York Civic Trust, Fairfax House, after a heavy restoration by an architect who shall be nameless, and there are many churches, which are also part of the story. Well, it does include gateways, the streets, and here we're, of course, looking through Bootham Bar into Petergate, with a run of buildings, many of which have been studied and can be best understood now by reference to the Royal Commission volume, as most of them are still in private ownership. Here's the wealth of buildings on the riverside, with something from the Middle Ages on the left, the pub, something from the height of the 18th century in the middle, and something from still within the remit, I think, of the Commission on the right, from the Victorian era, and a host of other buildings behind. So that volume too is a tour de force. It involves streets like Coney Street, where now there are going to be a huge amount of movement as Coney Street is developed, and for which the references for what lies within these buildings, preserved in the volume over there, ought to be taken into account anyway by the new developers as they move forward. Make sure they do. But you know, they're good friends, and I think they know the name of the game these days. We're looking down towards Exhibition Square, and on the right, an obvious timber frame building, but a whole series of others suggesting themselves. And this takes us back to the centre of York in front of the Mansion House, and yet another church. Whole streets of buildings have to be recorded in this volume, and this is, of course, Shambles, which everybody thinks is the most famous medieval street. Unfortunately, it's been identified in popular imagination with a street mentioned in the Harry Potter books, Diagon Alley, and now it's completely flooded by enthusiasts for Harry Potter on the grounds that this is Diagon Alley. But it was, for the Royal Commission, one of the earliest streets they tackled in 1947, I think, Valerie, probably, where it was under, quotes, restoration by the City Council. The City Council had woken up to the fact that one of its assets was heritage. I don't know whether they used that term in those days, but they knew that the Shambles brought tourists into York, so they spent a lot of money in the restoration of many of these buildings, which meant that the opportunity was there to study them, but it was also meant that some various early types of restoration were done that you wouldn't do it nowadays, put it that way. But there it is, a big incident in the life of those wonderful people in the Royal Commission. Here's another of their choice presentations, Lady Row, which is in Goodrham Gate, and it's an area which has, of course, runs of historic buildings, but this particular group, 14th century run of shops. The commission staff, having identified this type of development in York, found another run rather similar, not quite so complete, in New Street, and they found evidence no longer surviving, but in terms of maps and descriptions in Old Walk. And so one of the categories, as it were, of York historic buildings that turned out of this great study was the Lady Row kind of shop rows. They also worked further up the further up the street, and we're now looking back down Goodrham Gate at the buildings on the left. And here I want to remind you of the staff who actually was involved in these historic buildings. A particular one was a chap called Eric G. He was a national expert on vernacular buildings. They weren't called vernacular buildings in those days. They were, I forgot what they were called, timber frames or something like that. But anyhow, Eric knew all that was necessary to know about these things, had a lovely, friendly relationship, and like many of his staff, joined the local societies and became president of the Yorkshire, all that sort of thing, Yorkshire Archaeological Society, and bless him, would take tours around York. So I remember going on a tour around York with Eric, and I'll be able to mention two things that he mentioned to me. But he said, let's go down this alleyway here, which I think somewhere over on the left of this slide, and we did. And he said, down this passageway here, down this passageway. There it is, and we go down the passageway, and well, it wasn't quite like that when we found it. It was a wreck of an old building. But he said, I think we're looking at a Wealden house. That might mean something to some of you. It didn't, in those days, mean much to me. I then eventually had a job in the Weald, and so I learned all about Wealden houses. They're absolutely typical of Kent and Sussex. And here's one in the middle of York. And so he postulated as to how that might have happened and who it was who came up saying, I'm not having one of these bloody northern things, have a proper house. And it's, sorry, I swear at lectures, you're not allowed to do that. It had a double jetted ends and another double jetted end, okay? And then in the middle, between the two-story bits, is an open hall right up to the ceiling. And Eric recognized it. It didn't look like that at all. It was all covered in modern stuff. But he was able to point out those. And we all said, oh, Eric, that's fantastic. It's wonderful. And he said, yes, well, maybe other ones around in York. Shall we go in? And we went in. I've forgotten what kind of a shop it was. But he said, I've advised them to clear it out and go back to the original layout. So if you go in that shop nowadays, there is a central hall. And you can see right up into the beams. And you can see the two-story ends. And every time I go by, I think of dear old Eric and his nonchalant explanations of buildings of this sort. This reminds me of another trip, or maybe it was the same day, I can't recall, with Eric G. He says, it didn't look like this in those days, it was all plastered up, but you could see that timber work on the left. And he said, I think this timber work shows that we're in a screens passage. And I said, well, what's a screens passage? Oh, well, screens passage is the bottom end of a great hall, you know. To the right, you find the kitchen and the pantry, and to the left, you find the hall. I think there's one here, you know, somewhere in there. Let's go on, and on we went. Well, I sort of remembered that, and many years later, when restoration was being proposed in that area, and I was, by that time, Director of the Archaeological Trust, I alerted the potential developers who employed a buildings scholar, historic buildings scholar to survey, and by golly, yes, there were remains of that great hall on the left and the the pantry and kitchen on the right. And this was the Screen's passage between. Why they have a roadway going through it. It's called Barley Hall, Coffee Yard these days. Why Coffee Yard was allowed to go right through the middle of your house, who can tell? But anyhow, it did. And there we are. It's now been restored. It was going to be restored. It was going to be converted in a, I wouldn't say, terribly sympathetic way. And I had long conversations with the developer, who eventually said, "Oh, Peter, why don't you just buy it off us?" And by that time, the Jorvik Viking Centre was making loads of dosh. And so we did. And did a massive restoration job on it. It's perhaps over-restored, but at least most of what you see there was evidenced by some sort of timber work that had survived in that otherwise very uninteresting gang of modern offices. And it's become quite a popular place these days to learn something about the culture and life of York in the late Middle Ages. It was taken over by the York Archaeological Trust, having experienced the success of the Jorvik Centre in giving some impression of what life in a Viking town in York might have been like. And why not try something similar for life in late medieval York? So, yeah, Eric was absolutely right. Whoops, I'm not sure what's happened now. Do I go back? Yep. This beam up here is original, but it really wasn't any longer adequate to take the massive structure above it. So this is a modern one that's been added to strengthen it. Quite a lot of the others modern, but for every element of it we've preserved at least one piece of the original structure so that you can see the evidence on which the work was based. We did in fact also excavate the interior and have used evidence from archaeological sites around York to suggest how a late medieval hall in the heart of the commercial centre of York, north of the Ouse, might have looked. But it wouldn't have happened if the Royal Commission hadn't surveyed it. And I doubt it would have happened if I hadn't been on that trip with Eric G that day. Anyhow, time went by and the Royal Commission went through volume after volume. Eventually, the White House was given up and they came to number 1 Petergate, High Petergate, this building here. And many, many years later, I came to see some of my old friends. I think Herman Ram was still there. Ron Butler, a distinguished Romanist who studied the Roman defences, was still there. It was a windy, wet day in October, and they were in there. They were in their common room, which was this room on the ground floor. And they said, "Oh, come, let's sit at the window. You'll enjoy this, Peter." I thought, that's strange. What's this? And we were watching out, and the gusts of wind that came down from the towers of York Minster every so often blew somebody off their bike. And every time somebody went off a bike, oh, there goes another. And the entire room of inspectors would scream with laughter. And anyhow, that's my recollection of that building. Let's move on. Here are some of the other volumes. Excavations at the York Minster, Volume 2, is actually to do with the Minster. And there is a view of the Minster from my house, our bedroom, where my lovely neighbours are, my relations are currently staying. And for that, the story that is worth telling about the Royal Commission's work relates to the tower. I was up here in 1966. It was, do you remember 1066? And somebody suggested, "Peter, why don't you celebrate 2066 by excavating the Norman motte at Bale Hill?" And so for the Royal Commission on Historical Monuments, I was up here doing that. No, the Royal Archaeological Institute, I was doing that. And somebody said, there's a dig going on under the Minster Tower. I thought, what? And popped over there, and there was my old tutor from Cambridge, Brian Hope Taylor, in a deep hole. I said, "Brian, what are you doing down there?" And he said, Peter, I can't say. I really can't say. But one day you'll know. Brian, come off it, come on. No, I'm sorry. Well, subsequently, of course, it turned out the Minster Tower was cracking. The foundations were giving way. Brian was checking what was going on for the engineers. And then this followed several years of massive excavations that resulted in what's now the Undercroft below York Minster, and a huge amount of archaeology, largely done and led by initially Herman Ram, but by then he was towards the end of his career and it was beyond him. So he handed it over to Derek Phillips, and Derek Phillips spent years with a team of fantastic young archaeologists excavating what is now the Undercroft, recording the Roman, Anglo-Saxon, Viking Age and medieval deposits below the Minster, and creating what is really a new and absolutely amazing archaeological attraction for York. Yes, there we are. It's the tower slowly sinking into the ground that led to all that. And here is the result. The Royal Commission's volumes, Excavations at York Minster, Volume 1. I think that Derek was a member of the Royal Commission staff. Certainly they took responsibility for it. And the first person to work on that project was Herman Ram, the aforementioned Romanist from their team. So their logo is on all the excavation reports for this huge work at the Tower of York Minster and then under the West End and so forth. Roman to Norman, the Roman legionary fortress and its exploitation in the early Middle Ages. Fantastic bit of work. If you haven't read it, it's quite a challenge, I tell you. It's 2 volumes and it's on the table there at the moment. While they were at it, I turned up to do those rescue excavations on the Ring Road and so on. And this team was working away in York Minster. And I think they felt they ought to be doing the other archaeology as well. There were some very, very clever archaeologists. And I remember one of the first things that we tumbled across with the Archaeological Trust was this Roman sewer in Church Street. And even I was a bit sort of shattered by this thing and gave Derek Phillips a ring. Yes, he said, I'll come and help you. So Derek dived in with me and we went down this extraordinary tunnel that runs parallel off Church Street and recorded it. And at that stage he said, can I lend you some of my staff? And his staff were, by that time, having excavated most of York Minster, incredibly skilled. They were all young, they were all bright, and many of them have become distinguished archaeologists. One of them has become the president of the Council of British Archaeology. Another has become, 2 of them have become professors, etc. But these were young men and young women of sort of enormous enthusiasm for archaeology. And those were people who eventually, as I say, became great in their own right as a result of their work on that massive investigation of York Minster. Well, I've mentioned an awful lot of people today, and one of the things I haven't been able to do is show you pictures of them. I just haven't been able to. Mrs. Black eventually gave me some pictures that I could have used, but I couldn't find pictures of them. So you had to imagine them. But here's one. This is John Harvey. John Harvey joined the team as a medievalist, worked on the area, the volume for York south of the river, was an influence in the general writing of the thing, and of course very famous in his own right because of all the other books that he produced over the years. Well, there it is. If you want a monument, ladies and gentlemen, to the monument men and women of York, this is it. This stack of books on the table, and I suggest if you haven't read them, off you go. Have a read.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for that wonderful exposition. I know personally that owning those volumes over the last, how many years we've lived in York, which is more than 50 now, has added so much to our ability to get round the city and find out things. And anything you really need to know about the history of York is contained therein. Obviously, the motive for this particular Festival of Ideas this year is making waves. But I think we can certainly say that the Royal Commission and Peter, in their time in York, have made really big waves, which have resulted in all sorts of things happening in York, which otherwise might not have happened. And without them, for example, we might not now be considering York as a site of a World Heritage Site. So thank you very much, Peter, for that. Thank you to the university very much, and for all the help from the people who've helped with the Festival of Ideas. And have a lovely day, and hope we shall see you again at some other future Sheldon event before too long. Thank you very much, and thank you, Peter.